Hello writers! How are you all doing? Happy December. How was your NaNoWriMo if you participated? In my book, everyone who wrote words at all is a winner of Nano. So congratulations if you wrote words this past November. I have a couple of announcements before we dive into our topic for today, which is POV. Point of view, and why I love third person point of view so much. The first is that Maureen and I are going to be announcing some new classes. So if you want to be notified about those classes, then you should sign up for our newsletter. The second thing is that I am also the incoming editor and co-publisher of MermaIds Monthly magazine, which is a literary journal about mermaids and mermaid lore and sea creatures and nautical themes and art and poems and comics. It's a gorgeous magazine that was started by Julia Rios and Meg Frank. They ran a Kickstarter for it last fall, and we're running a Kickstarter to fund 2022, and I will leave the link in the description box below if you're interested in that. But basically it's gonna be super exciting, and we have really great plans for it, and we already have a bunch of awesome contributors lined up for it. As soon as we hit our minimum funding goal, we'll be able to open to general submissions. And go check out the MermaIds Monthly Kickstarter. Okay, I have rambled on long enough. The first thing I want to say is that point of view is an ingredient in fiction, and this goes back to the whole metaphor around Story Kitchen and why Maureen and I call it Story Kitchen, because these elements are like ingredients. And like ingredients, you can use them in all kinds of ways. It's extremely flexible and adaptable to your particular style, and indeed the style that you want your story to take. So while I could say a lot about POV or point of view in general, I really want to focus on third person today, just because I think even just focusing on one general subgenre of POV there's a lot to say. It's not that it's complicated per se, it's just that there is a lot of impact that POV has on your story, and therefore there can be a lot of different ways to think about it. And I want to make sure that we explore that kind of thoroughly, because I'm fascinated by POV, and I think it is one of the most powerful ways that you can completely drastically alter your story in kind of fundamental ways. I think it is perfectly possible to write a gorgeous, wonderful story without really thinking about POV. For a lot of us, what point of view we choose to write in for whatever story we're writing comes quite instinctively and naturally. And I think that's totally fine. And if that's working for you, don't mess with something that works. This discussion is not meant to make you hyper self-aware or too overly self-conscious about the POVs that you're using in your stories. But I do think, A, it's interesting to learn more about craft things like POV, at least it is for me. And B, the more you learn about these things, the more that you can self-diagnose when you feel like things aren't quite working in a story that you're working on. And that might be because of your point of view or how you're approaching the point of view. So it can be a really useful diagnostic tool. It is also really cool to see the range of POVs to help stretch yourself in areas. If you're interested in developing skills that you feel like you're a little bit weaker in, or that you aren't quite as developed in, then POV is one awesome exploration to try to stretch your skills and practice things, writing things a little bit outside of your own comfort zone. For example, if you've always believed and maybe been told that second person is a no-no and it's awkward and don't do it, maybe these discussions about POV will encourage you to just try writing a flash piece in second person and see what happens. I'm not going to talk about second person today, although I do have a story out that's kind of in second person. It's actually more direct address than in second person, which I will link to below. It's called A Bridge Between, and it came out in Baffling magazine last month. No, in October issue. Okay, wow, I'm very rambly today. Let me consult my notes here. And I want to zoom out just a little bit again. Sorry for all the sort of framing conversations that I like to do. It's the lapsed academic in me. I can't help it. I want to zoom out a little bit on POV in general and talk a little bit about what it is. I think a lot of us writers have sort of an intuitive understanding of POV. It means perspective. But the thing that's also important to remember is that perspectives can be kind of infinite, right? Especially in third person. And that's one of the reasons that I love third person, is for how flexible it is. You can be in third person and you can be really up close. You can be a little bit distanced from the character whose perspective you're in, and you can be completely zoomed way out from the character whose POV you're in. You could have a godlike perspective, you could have a fly on the wall kind of perspective, and skilled writers can easily shift in between those different layers of distance. This is known as psychic distance. I first encountered that term, psychic distance, which literally means how close the perspective is to the psyche of the protagonist, or of the character whose perspective you're trying to depict. Psychic distance is a term that I first encountered in John Gardner's book, which I can't remember the title of right now. And I can't remember which of his books it was in, so I will double check that and link that below. But John Gardner talks about psychic distance and how a skilled writer, once you learn how to manipulate that psychic distance and leverage it, then you can do amazing things with your POV and with measuring the impact on the reader in really interesting ways. So I think it's worth thinking about and paying a little bit of attention to, even if you are already comfortable in the POV that you're working in. I love third person. I have also written in second person. I've also written in first person. I like those things, but there's something about third person. I almost feel like this is a defense of third person. Not that it needs a defense, because it probably is the most popular POV to write in. But the thing that I love about third person is, like I said before, how incredibly flexible, adaptable, and malleable it is. And even within a single scene or a paragraph, you can have the psychic distance compressed or elongated in really interesting ways. And if you're graceful about it and skilled about it, then it's going to be really smooth and easy to read and have a wonderful impact. So I think that this kind of thing is best shown by examples. So I've picked out a few examples so we can kind of talk about it and you can think about it along with me as we discuss third person. So the first one I want to talk about is the third person objective, which is sort of the fly on the wall kind of thing. And this is the perspective that most feels like, I guess, cinematic. Like you're watching a movie and you are observing the characters and the situation happening and the dialogue and so on, but the author is not giving you any interiority, or you basically have to excavate all of the clues of how the characters are feeling and what they're thinking. Although this style is used in conjunction with things like limited and omniscient and other things that we'll get to, the kind of extreme version of this, where the whole story is written in objective third person, has, I would say, fallen out of favor just a little bit. I can't think of many contemporary SFF stories that are written this way. But a big writer who wrote this way is Hemingway. Jack London did it as well, and other writers of that era, but I want to read a little excerpt from the very beginning of Hills Like White Elephants. The hills across the valley of the Ebro were long and white. On this side there was no shade and no trees, and the station was between two lines of rails in the sun. Close against the side of the station there was the warm shadow of the building, and a curtain, made of strings of bamboo beads, hung across the open door into the bar to keep out flies. The American and the girl with him sat at a table in the shade outside the building. It was very hot, and the express from Barcelona would come in 40 minutes. It stopped at this junction for 2 minutes and went on to Madrid. We get a lot of pretty objective description. There are tiny little value judgments in here, like the fact that it was very hot is obviously, you know, a relative. Heat is relative. So the narrator, although they're being quite objective, is telling us that they are hot. But they also tell us things like to keep out flies. The bamboo bead curtain is to keep out flies. That again is a derived assumption about the function of the bead curtain that isn't necessarily just from the bead curtain, if you know what I mean. That's not, you know, there's a little bit of judgment there. The express from Barcelona would come in 40 minutes. This suggests, although it's quite distant, that one or more of the characters are waiting for this express, or they're anticipating it somehow. What should we drink? The girl asked. She had taken off her hat and put it on the table. It's pretty hot, the man said. Let's drink beer. Dos cervezas, the man said into the curtain. Big ones? A woman asked from the doorway. Yes, 2 big ones. And it kind of goes on like this in this very, very, again, objective style where you don't get anything about what the characters are feeling or thinking. You're just getting these observational details. So it literally is as if you are eavesdropping on them at the bar and just watching this whole play out. In fact, we don't even learn their names until I think at some point the man does call the woman by a name. Yeah, Jig, I think. But the narrator never uses that name to refer. The narrator always calls that character the girl. All of the interiority, all of what's actually happening in this story, because there's really no plot other than they drink beer and they talk and then they drink something else and then the train shows up. All of the actual core of the story has to be unearthed or excavated by the reader. By reading between the lines of this dialogue and by us trying to decipher what these characters are feeling, what they might be thinking, and what the story is actually about. So that's a kind of interesting intellectual exercise. It creates a barrier, right? We're sort of removed from these characters a little bit, and yet at the same time, the fact that we have to work so hard to get into their heads kind of is the thing that's pulling us in. So it's this really interesting tension between feeling like these characters are at a distance from us and yet us wanting to get closer and closer, as if we're trying to eavesdrop, you know, deeper and deeper into their conversation and kind of inching ourselves closer so we can get into their hearts and see what's actually going on. So it creates this really interesting push-pull effect, I think, and it can be quite effective in getting a certain kind of reader who enjoys that kind of exercise to deeply engage with your story. So this is what I mean by distant POVs don't necessarily have to be distancing for the reader, if that makes sense. The objective third person is an extremely removed and distant POV, or it can be. It usually is, because we're not getting any emotions directly told to us. But it doesn't have to be distancing, because we can want to know so badly about the characters that we close the distance ourselves as much as we can. And we try so hard to understand the characters that it can actually be more engaging and more immersive in some cases than when the emotions are just told straight out to us, or when we get transparent insight into whatever they're thinking and feeling. So something to think about. No POV is inherently more distancing or engaging or immersive than another, in my opinion. The other thing I want to say is that I'm not dealing with tense at all, like past tense, present tense, future tense, but tense is intimately and inextricably tied to POV. Because if you think about it, POV really means perspective, right? It is the point of view of someone, and the perspective includes their position in time as well as in space. Like, how far away from the timeline of the events are we learning about these events? Is it something that happened to these characters far in the past, and so therefore there's a layer of kind of memory and recall that is also part of the story? Or is it in present tense and therefore immediate and it's happening right now, and there's really no time for the character to filter or reflect or think about anything. We're just right there, right? Those all impact the POV, the perspective of the story. But there's too much to talk about, so I'm going to save that for another day. But just remember throughout this discussion that tense is definitely part of POV, and I'm sorry that we're not going to get to it. Next, let's talk about third person limited, which is an extremely common and very, very well-known POV choice, and you've probably read lots of things in this. Third person limited doesn't necessarily mean that we have to be close the entire time. To me, what it simply means is that you're limited to the perspective of one character, and that distance, the psychic distance, could still be close or far or move in between the two as necessary or as the writer feels like it. So I am going to read from this wonderful novel, She Who Became the Sun, by Shelley Parker Chan, which is in limited third person, or the first chapter is at any rate. I want to show you how the author moves from distance closer to the character in this really graceful way. So chapter 1, this is the beginning of this novel. Zhongli village lay flattened under the sun like a defeated dog that has given up on finding shade. Wow, like that is almost omniscient, right? There's an omniscient narrator who is sort of telling us, giving us this image of this village like a defeated dog, which is a very loaded and vivid image, and to me that kind of almost signals omniscient narrator, which we'll get to. All around there was nothing but the bare yellow earth, cracked into the pattern of a turtle's shell, and the sear bone smell of hot dust. It was the 4th year of the drought. Knowing the cause of their suffering, the peasants cursed their barbarian emperor in his distant capital in the north. Here we're still very far out, and again almost omniscient, because we're saying knowing the cause of their suffering, the peasants cursed their barbarian emperor. So the narrator is telling us about this group of people that the limited character, or the character that we're going to meet, doesn't have direct access to. I'm going to scoot ahead to the very next paragraph, which goes, "The Zhu family's second daughter, who was more or less 10 years old in that parched rooster year, was thinking about food as she followed the village boys toward the dead neighbor's field. With her wide forehead and none of the roundness that makes children adorable." Here again, we're seeing her from outside of herself. She's not thinking, oh, I have a round forehead, or I have a wide forehead and I'm not an adorable child. That's not her thought. It's a narrator judgment. She had the mandibular look of a brown locust. Again, mandibular is not part of this girl's vocabulary. Probably. This is the narrator. Like that insect, the girl thought about food constantly. However, having grown up on a peasant's monotonous diet and with only a half-formed suspicion of that better things might exist, her imagination was limited in the dimension of quantity. At that moment, and here we dive right into her deep, intimate POV. At that moment, she was busy thinking about a bowl of millet porridge. Her mind's eye had filled it past the lip, liquid quivering high with the taut skin, and as she walked, she contemplated with a voluptuous, anxious dreaminess how she might take the first spoonful without losing a drop. Okay, so what I want to emphasize here is that within 2 paragraphs, we have zoomed from this omniscient narrator giving us a little bit of story, showing us the village from a kind of bird's eye view, and we've zoomed right into this little girl's imagination where she is imagining this giant bowl of porridge filled to the top and how she's going to sip it without spilling a drop. And that is just so masterful and gracefully done. And Shelley Parker Chan manipulates POV like this throughout this book. And it's so fascinating. And you will see that POV in the hands of someone like Shelley Parker Chan is not like a fixed point that's always the same distance or is always showing you the same scope of a character. It can actually be used to move our attention in a scene and zoom outside of the scene and consider things that are past and therefore not part of the the timeline and consider things that are in the future and may become part of the timeline and so on. It is an extremely powerful tool, and it is something that you just really can't do in, say, first person, and is hard, although I think not impossible to do in second person. Anyway, go read that novel. It is fantastic. Where are my notes? Okay, so that was third person, and I would say that although we start out sort of omniscient, for the most part, the rest of that chapter is, in my opinion, more limited. In other words, we don't get access to any other single character except for her for most of the rest of that chapter. So it's limited to that character's ideas and perceptions and so on, even if it is not always intimate, even if it is somewhat distant. Now I want to read an example of third person limited very close that kind of sticks close and stays close in a sustained way for much of the scenes and for much of the book as well. And that is from this wonderful book called Light from Uncommon Stars by Rika Aoki, or maybe it's Rika Aoki. Actually, I don't know. I will look that up. All of these examples that I've chosen, except maybe the Hemingway. I mean, I don't mind Hemingway, but it's not like so good. But the other examples are examples of books I really love. Okay, so this is the very opening of Light from Uncommon Stars. Shh. Yes, it hurt. It was definitely not just a bruise. Yes, she was scared. Her throat was raw from screaming. Cautiously, Katrina Nguyen felt under her bed. Girl clothes, boy clothes, money, birth certificate, social security card, toothbrush, spare glasses, backup battery, makeup, oh my god, I can't pronounce that. Spironolactone. Katrina had made an escape bag the first time her father threatened to kill her. At first, the bag seemed in case of emergency, a glass that one would never break. But after tonight, why had she let it come to this? Why couldn't she be what her parents wanted? Part of her was in a panic. What have you done? Apologize. Knock on their door right now. Say it's all your fault. Say you're sorry. Say you'll promise to change. But another, stronger part of Katrina was calm, even cold. You have to escape tonight. Breathe, be quiet, and listen. This is definitely third person, right? We get Katrina. We get a little bit of backstory floated in here. Katrina had made an escape bag the first time her father had threatened to kill her, which isn't maybe necessarily exactly what she's thinking in the moment. But a lot of the rest of that short passage is very, very vividly about her internal monologue, her thoughts, her feelings. It's very present. We feel like we've really dived right inside of her, and we are transparently experiencing and understanding everything sort of through her eyes and in her own heart. And I just think it's so wonderfully done. I think this is a great example of close third. Sometimes for me personally, I read close third and it can become a bit exhausting because you feel like you're too close to this character and you can't get away, and it starts getting a tiny bit claustrophobic. I feel that way about some kinds of first person as well. Again, this is just a preference thing, right? It's not good or bad, or one's not better or worse than another. But for some reason, this writer is able to modulate that closeness in a way that, to me, never evokes that feeling of, oh my gosh, I'm trapped inside this person. And it's really interesting to me. And actually, I need to reread this novel to figure out how she's doing it, because it's just an astonishing feat to sustain. There are multiple characters in this, but they're all, I think, if I recall correctly, they're all in this kind of very close, limited third perspective. So yeah, it's just really fascinating. And I think part of it is the gracefulness of the prose and the spareness, and the fact that she doesn't spend too much time describing emotions. She gives you that sort of hit of what the character is feeling, and then that's it. That's all you get. We don't dwell on it. We don't sort of sit in it for a long time. There's a lot of forward momentum, and I think that helps both keep the story moving, but also keep us from feeling sort of trapped inside someone's POV. Finally, I want to talk about Omniscient. I feel like there's sometimes some confusion about Omniscient, that it's the same as multiple third person limited. Like, oh, it's a narrator who has access to all the different characters and can tell you what they're thinking and feeling in the course of a single scene. I would say that is not what we mean classically speaking or formally speaking, or I don't know. I don't want to get elitist here, but to me, that is multiple limited third person. I know, am I splitting hairs? I know this might be a little ridiculous, but I understand that more as multiple limited third person, when you're getting access to thoughts in one paragraph and then someone else's thoughts in another, but we're very close to everybody all throughout. Omniscient to me is more like there is a narrator who has access to characters' interiority, but also has their own judgment about them. And a good example of that, I'm going to read 2 examples of that because I think Omniscient is fascinating and there's a lot of different ways to do it, A, and B, because I feel like Omniscient is coming back. I don't know, this is just my feeling. Omniscient was the primary form for novels in the English language for a really long time. Of course, first person has always been popular as well, but Omniscient was very standard for a very long time. And then it really fell out of favor for whatever reason in the last couple decades, and I feel like it's coming back, and I'm really excited about that because I love it and I think it's a very powerful and useful voice to write in. This is from the fantastic book The Haunting of Hill House by the maestro Shirley Jackson. And here's the very famous opening paragraph. No live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are supposed by some to dream. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there walked alone. So here we have a narrator who is giving us details about Hill House, but they know things that an omniscient narrator would know. And they make judgments. And by judgments, I don't mean like good and bad. I just mean that they are conveying their interpretations of reality, of characters or of places in this case. Or Hill House is sort of a character and a place. So we're told that Hill House is not sane. So there is a interpretation by the narrator. It had stood for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. So there again is a projection, an interpretation. The doors were sensibly shut. So this narrator thinks that it is sensible for the doors to be shut, right? There's a little bit of attitude there. Whatever walked there walked alone. And then we go to Dr. John Montague was a doctor of philosophy. He had taken, and then we learn more about this character. And again, the narrator is like God, like the omniscient being, the author, is able to give us some backstory about Dr. John Montague, and that's all sort of told in summary. I want to read another example of Omniscient, which is from a murder mystery by Georgette Heyer. Is it Heyer or Heyer? It's Heyer, right? Heyer. And this is a novel called Envious Casca. It is quite an interesting omniscient, I think, because, well, you'll see. Okay, so chapter 1, again, the beginning of this book, Envious Casca. It was a source of great satisfaction to George Heriard that the holly trees were in full berry. He seemed to find in this circumstance an assurance that the projected reunion of the family would be a success. For days past he had been bringing prickly sprigs into the house, his rosy countenance beaming with pleasure, and his white locks, worn rather long and grandly waving, ruffled by the December winds. "Just look at the berries," he would say, thrusting his sprigs under Nathaniel's nose, laying them on Maud's card table. "Very pretty, dear," Maud said, her flattened voice divesting her words of even the smallest vestige of enthusiasm. "Take the damn thing away," growled Nathaniel. "I hate holly." Okay, so we already have a lot going on in this very short opening. So it was a source of great satisfaction to Joseph Herriard. So this is the narrator telling us that this character feels a lot of satisfaction about decorating the house for Christmas with the holly. But then the next sentence is, "He seemed to find in this circumstance an assurance." So here, it's interesting, right? The narrator doesn't say he found in this circumstance an assurance. The narrator isn't 100% sure. The narrator is observing and making assumptions or guesses about what Joseph Herriard feels. He seemed to find assurance. And then the narrator tells us a little bit about what's happened, the interactions with some of the other characters. And let's see, I want to say, oh yeah, here. So then I'm going to skip just a little bit ahead to talk about the house. Lexham was a Tudor manor house, considerably enlarged, but retaining enough of its original character to make it one of the show places of the neighborhood. It was not a family seat of long standing. Nathaniel, who was a wealthy man, he had been an importer from the East Indies, having purchased it a few years before his retirement from an active share in his flourishing business. His niece, Paula Herriard, who did not like the manor, could not imagine what should have induced an old bachelor to saddle himself with such a place, unless, hopefully, he meant to leave it to Stephen, her brother. In which case, she added, it was a pity that Stephen, who did not like the place, should take so few pains to be decent to the old man. Here, again, we've got some really interesting things. So we have a bit of objective description. Lexham was a Tudor manor house. It's been enlarged. It was one of the show places of the neighborhood. That's a little bit of a judgment. It's not objective. It was not and then a little backstory, but then we dive right into Paula, who did not like the manor and could not imagine what should have induced an old bachelor to saddle himself with such a place. So now we're getting Paula's attitude and Paula's judgments and Paula's interpretation, unless, hopefully, he meant to leave it to Stephen. So that's not the narrator saying hopefully, that is the narrator telling us that Paula is hopeful that Nathaniel means to leave the manor to Stephen. In which case, she added, so is she saying this or is she adding this in her own head? Or is this something that she said a lot in this sequence before? When the subject comes up, maybe she always adds this. In which case she added, it was a pity that Stephen, who did not like, etc. So you can see how third-person omniscient can be so interesting as a way of reflecting on the attitudes of all the characters while also retaining a little bit about the author's perspective and the author's point of view and the author's interpretation. There's a great deal of control, I think, as a writer when you're using third person. You can do a lot with it. Okay, I feel like I have rambled on a lot and this is getting pretty long, so I think I will stop there. But as an exercise, if you want to stretch your POV muscles and learn more about this essential ingredient in writing, then I suggest that you pick up a few different things to read from a variety of genres, and maybe even just read this, the samples if you download them on your Kindle or on your iBook or whatever, or go to the library and download a few books. And definitely explore classic books and books from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, as well as contemporary books, because POV is sort of a style that has changed a lot over the years. And just read the first chapter or so and ask yourself, what is the perspective? How does it change? How is the author manipulating the perspective or leveraging the perspective? And critically, as always, how does it make me feel? What is the impact of it on the story that's being told? And I think you might find some really interesting answers for yourself. And you'll probably learn a lot about what you like and dislike about point of view and how it makes you feel. And next time you're sitting down to write something, maybe paying just a little more attention to point of view. Again, if it's useful, if it's helpful, if it's fun, maybe that could take your writing to a different place than you thought it could go. Okay, that's it for today. Happy writing.